Hello and welcome. So when people think of Haworth, they usually come because of Charlotte, Emily and Anne Brontë. They visit the parsonage, walk out on the moors, and they follow in the footsteps of one of Yorkshire's most famous families. But today I want to introduce you to someone most people have never even heard of. A young woman called Nancy Garrs, usually known simply as Nancy Garrs. She arrived at the Brontë household when she was only about 13 years old, and she spent the next 8 years helping to look after the children through their earliest years. She was there when they... Hello, cat! She was there when they were babies, toddlers and young children, and she played with them, cared for them and helped keep the household running through some of the family's most difficult times. Yet today, hardly anyone remembers her name. Yesterday, I visited Undercliff Cemetery in Bradford because this is where Nancy's story ends. When she died in 1886, she was buried there, but for more than a century, there was nothing to mark her grave. No headstone, no memorial, and the exact spot gradually disappeared beneath the grass and the weeds and was almost forgotten completely. Almost, because thanks to some determined research and a lot of hard work from volunteers, Nancy finally has the memorial she never had in life. We'll find out how a shoemaker's daughter from Bradford became part of the Brontë household, how she helped care for the Brontë children through their earliest years, and why she spent decades defending Patrick Brontë, and how, long after she left Haworth, she never stopped talking about the family that she loved. So grab yourself a cup of tea or a cold glass of water and let's meet Nancy Garrs. Gosh, I am so warm. It's so hot today. And before we get started, I should probably explain why I'm not still standing in Undercliff Cemetery. Well, when I visited Nancy's grave yesterday, it happened to be during one of those rare British heat waves, and I think it's still happening now, when the weather seems to forget what country it's in. Had every intention of filming so much there, but between the heat, the bright sunshine and a camera that was determined to overheat before I did, it became clear that it wasn't going to happen. I had water, yes, and I had sun cream, and I came fully prepared. But there comes a point when you're standing in this large cemetery surrounded by stone graves that seem to be reflecting the heat from every possible direction, and you realise you're becoming hot, tired and increasingly incapable of forming sensible sentences. So I was determined to go and say hello to Nancy, and I'm really glad I did. But eventually common sense won. God, I'm really struggling. I don't like this. So I headed off in search of some shade, a cold drink and a chance to cool down before carrying on. And now, a day later, I've kind of recovered. So let's go back to the beginning and let's meet Nancy Garrs. To understand Nancy's story, we need to go right back to the beginning. Nancy wasn't born into the Brontë family. She was born in Bradford in 1803 and was the eldest of 12 children. I mean, that's a lot of mouths to feed, and from a young age she would have been used to helping look after the younger children around the house. It was what was expected. Her family name was actually de Garrs, although over time people knew the family simply as Garrs. And in fact, it is not completely unlike the way the Brontës eventually became the Brontës. By 1816, Patrick and his wife Maria Brontë were living at Thornton Parsonage with their 3 young daughters. We've got Maria, Elizabeth and baby Charlotte. That's just weird to think of her as a baby. Maria was only 33 years old and already had 3 children under the age of 3, so life must have been incredibly busy. Mariah's sister, Elizabeth Bramwell, had been down to visit but had now returned to Cornwall, and Mariah had felt the loss of those extra pair of hands. The household needed help, so Patrick turned to the Bradford School of Industry, a charity school that trained girls from poorer families for domestic service. One of the girls recommended was our 13-year-old Nancy. Now, 13 sounds astonishingly young to us today because, well, it is, isn't it? I mean, at 13, most children are worrying about schools, friends, mobile phones, and what they're going to be doing at the weekend. Nancy, meanwhile, was about to leave home and move into a vicarage and help care for 3 small children. I mean, it's really hard to imagine, but by all accounts, she took to the role brilliantly. And that's what I found so remarkable about Nancy's story. Not because she was unusual for her time. Sadly, many children had to grow up quickly in the 19th century, but because of what happened next. Nancy didn't just stay for a few months. She became part of the household. And as the Brontë family grew, Nancy's responsibilities grew with it. Bramwell arrived in 1817 and then Emily followed in 1818. The family now had 5 children under the age of 5 and needed that extra help more than ever. Nancy had impressed Patrick and Mariah so much that they asked for another girl from the same family. And that girl was Nancy's younger sister, Sarah. We think Sarah was about 12 years old herself when she started, and it's quite extraordinary when you stop and think about it because the Brontë children were being cared for by 2 girls whom by modern standards were still children themselves. With Sarah taking over many of Nancy's duties in the nursery, Nancy was promoted to cook and assistant housekeeper. Oh, go Nancy! Again, just think about that for a moment. Nancy was still in her mid-teens, yet she was helping to run a busy household with 5 young children. It's easy to focus on the famous names in a story and overlook everyone around them. But when Charlotte was a toddler, and when Bramwell was getting into mischief, when Emily was a baby and Anne hadn't even been born yet, Nancy was there. Long before anyone had heard of Jane Eyre or Wuthering Heights or Agnes Grey, Nancy and Sarah were simply helping to care for this growing family. And before long, that family would leave Thornton behind and begin a whole new chapter in Haworth. In April 1820, the Brontë family packed up their belongings and left Thornton behind. Their destination was Haworth. Patrick had accepted the position at St Michael's and All Angels Church, and the family moved into the parsonage that would later become famous around the world. But of course, nobody knew that at this time. For Nancy, this wasn't just a change of address. It meant leaving her connections with Bradford and starting again in a completely new place. And she wasn't making the journey alone, thank goodness. By now, the household included Patrick, the mother Mariah, and their 5 children, Nancy, of course, and Sarah as well. Not long after they arrived in Haworth, another baby joined the family, little Anne Brontë, in January 1820. I mean, just imagine the noise and the chaos of that household. 6 young children, 2 young servants, a busy clergyman, a mother trying to keep everything running smoothly. There can't have been many quiet moments in that house. But by this point, Nancy had been with the family for 4 years. Charlotte was no longer a baby. Bramwell and Emily were growing extremely quickly. And of course, Anne had arrived too. Oh, the children must have known Nancy and Sarah almost as well as they knew their own family. But sadly, the happy years didn't last long because in September 1821, Mariah Brontë, the mother, died after a long illness. She was only 38. For the Brontë children, losing their mother was devastating. And for Patrick, it meant facing the future alone with 6 young children. And for Nancy and Sarah, it meant their roles became even more important. They couldn't replace a mother, of course. Nobody could. But they were familiar faces in a house that had suddenly been turned upside down by grief. They helped care for the children through one of the most difficult periods in their lives. And at first, Mariah's sister, Elizabeth Bramwell, came from Cornwall to help the family. And what began as this temporary arrangement gradually became a permanent one. And Aunt Brontë would remain at Haworth for so many years. And I actually did a video about good old Aunt Brontë not so long ago, so I'll pop a link in the description if you want to know more about her time with the Brontes and of course in Haworth. Most people know about Aunt Brontë's importance in the Brontë story, and rightly so, but I sometimes think that Nancy and Sarah get overlooked. They were there too, not as relatives, not as famous figures in Brontë history, just two young women quietly getting on with the work that needed doing. Cooking meals, washing clothes, looking after the children and help keeping the household together at a time when everything must have felt so uncertain. And despite everything that was happening around them, the children still found time to play. And in fact, some of Nancy's most fascinating memories come from those ordinary days, because she wasn't just caring for the children, she was joining in with their games. And that's where we're going to head to next. So a friend has just dropped by and brought me an ice cream. Yay! Only problem is, as I've taken out the wrapper, the end dropped off. So we might have an accident if it decides to leak out the bottom, but we'll see how we get on. Because what I need though, it's so hot already. It's 1:30 and there's just no air, and the temperature out is 29. And I know for people that live in hot countries, that's not hot. Britain is not made for hot. Our wars are to keep the heat in, not to let the heat out. So yeah, it gets warm. I have got a fan, but I'm not going to put it on because I did a tester and it's a bit loud. So we're just going to stick with this and eat cold things. One of the things I like most about Nancy's story is that it gives us a glimpse of the Brontë children before they became the people we know from history books. Not the authors, not the famous names, just little children. And children needed something to do. Life at Haworth wasn't all lessons and chores. The children had vivid imaginations and were constantly inventing games and stories and adventures. Years later, Sarah remembered the games that they all played together. The stories were inspired by things the children had read in the newspaper, by tales told by their father, and by whatever captured their imagination that week. This is very nice. Sarah said that nothing seemed to escape their attention. And what I like about that memory is that Nancy and Sarah weren't simply supervising from a distance. They actually joined in. And when you remember that Nancy was still only in her late teens and Sarah was that bit younger, that suddenly makes a lot of sense. Yes, they were servants, and yes, they had responsibilities, but they were still young themselves and probably welcomed a break from the endless washing and cleaning and cooking and all the other domestic duties they had to do. You can easily imagine them becoming characters in whatever adventure the children had invented that day. Of course, not every day was spent indoors. Nancy and Sarah regularly took the children out onto the moors around Haworth, and one of those outings became memorable for a very different reason. On the 2nd of September 1824, Nancy and Sarah were out with Brontë, Emily and Anne when something extraordinary happened. After heavy rain, part of Crow Hill Bog collapsed in what became known as the Great Bog Burst. People described hearing an enormous roaring sound as huge quantities of peat and water came crashing down the hillside, destroying walls and bridges and farmland in its path. Patrick later described hearing what sounded like a distant explosion from Haworth. Nancy and Sarah were about 2 miles away with the children when the noise began, and nobody knew exactly what was happening. All they knew was that something was very wrong. They quickly gathered the children and took shelter in nearby Pondon Hall until the danger had passed. It is melting quickly. Now, we don't know exactly what was going through Nancy's mind at that moment, but she had the responsibility of 3 young children and suddenly found herself caught up in one of the most dramatic natural events the area had seen for years. It's one of those moments that remind us that Nancy wasn't just a servant in the sort of background of someone else's story. She was a real person and she made real decisions and caring for real children. And before long, big changes were coming. After 8 years with the family, Nancy's time at Haworth was drawing to a close. I'm going to have to eat some of this before it drips. Okay, I've decided eating an ice cream isn't the most glamorous of things. It's very slurpy and noisy. So do you know what? I'm going to go and sit outside, eat my ice cream, and I'll come back a bit later on. But it's ever so nice. It's strawberry. Strawberry and vanilla, I assume. But yeah, that bottom is looking like it's going to drip soon. So I might take it outside and it can drip on the floor. And no doubt the cat will come and clear it up. Sorry if I'm tempting you into an ice cream. Not my usual cup of tea. Brontë ice cream instead. So yes, I am in different clothes. It's the next day. Yes, I did drop ice cream all down myself. And yes, we then had a very large, loud thunderstorm, which made it impossible to record because every time I tried, the power went on and off, and yeah, it was really loud. So I decided to stop filming yesterday. It's now a fresh day. My hay fever is really bad, hence why I've got my glasses on instead of my contact lenses. Not as hot so far today, so I think we're in a good place to carry on with this video. It does feel like though I've been recording it for days now. But sometimes that's what happens. You cannot predict heat waves, thunderstorms, ice cream issues, and general life. By late 1824, another change was on the horizon. The older Brontë girls had gone away to school and Patrick was looking at ways to reduce household expenses. Aunt Bramwell, as we know, had now settled into life at the parsonage and there was less need for the number of servants the family had obviously once employed when the children were very young. For Nancy, it meant that after 8 years with the family, her time at Haworth was coming to an end. And it must have been a strange moment. Nancy had arrived at 13 years old and now she was a young woman in her early 20s. She'd spent all of her teenage years with the Brontë family. She'd watched the children grow, she'd helped care for them through the loss of their mother, and she'd actually become part of their everyday lives. Charlotte is 8, Emily is 6 and Anne is 4 at this point. They probably couldn't remember a time when Nancy hadn't been there. And it wasn't just the children who was fond of her. The affection seemed to have gone both ways. One of my favourite stories that I came across when looking into this from this period is Nancy had a young man in her life, and according to family recollection, one of Patrick Brontë's daughters mentioned to him that Nancy was planning to marry a man called Pat. So Patrick was amused by this and went into the kitchen and asked her about it himself. I can't do Irish, so this will have to do. "Why, Nancy, is it true that you are going to marry a Pat?" And Nancy replied, "Yes, sir, it is. And if he only proves 1/10 as kind as a husband as you have been, I shall think myself very happy in having made a Pat my choice." I mean, I've always liked that exchange because it feels so normal. And for a moment, we're not reading about historical figures. We're listening to a conversation between people who clearly knew and liked one another. Now, there's a small twist in this story, and it confused me, because the records show that Nancy eventually married a John, but this John is called John Patrick Wainwright. So it seems likely that Patrick Brontë and Nancy were using his middle name, Pat, just as obviously Bramwell Brontë uses his middle name rather than his first. I mean, it's just a little detail, but I think it helps bring these people to life. So Nancy left the parsonage in 1824, but in many ways the parsonage really never left her. And after leaving Haworth, she worked as a dressmaker, putting to use the skills that she'd obviously learned over the years. And then in 1830, she married John Patrick Wainwright. Their first daughter was called Emily Jane. Whether that was a tribute to Emily Brontë she'd obviously helped to raise, we'll never know for certain, but it's certainly an intriguing possibility and too much of a coincidence for me. A second daughter followed, Hannah, but sadly Hannah died in infancy, something that was obviously heartbreakingly common in the 19th century. And for a while, Nancy's life seemed to settle into a quieter pattern. She had a loving husband, she had a young family, and this future ahead of her. But fate had other plans, because in 1838, tragedy struck once again. And this time, it would change Nancy's life completely. In 1838, Nancy's life had changed dramatically. Her husband, John Patrick Wainwright, was working as an engineer tender at the original Salts Mill in Bradford when he was involved in a really serious accident. He died the following day. Nancy was only about 35 years old at the time, still very young. Suddenly, she found herself a widow with a young daughter to support. It's difficult to imagine just how precarious life could be in the 19th century, because one accident, one illness or one unexpected death could completely change a family's future just overnight. And of course there was no welfare state then, no widow's pension, no safety net waiting in the background. To his credit, Titus Salt did pay for John Pat's funeral, and there was a small payment from a friendly society. But it wasn't enough to provide long-term security. And by the time of 1841 census, Nancy was living with her sister Sarah again. I mean, the two sisters who had once worked together in Haworth found themselves supporting each other once more. It's one of those lovely little details, isn't it? Life has taken them in completely different directions. But when life becomes difficult, family was still family. And a few years later, Nancy found happiness again. And in 1844, she married John Malone, an Irishman who worked in the wool warehouse in Bradford. This second marriage would last almost 37 years. And compared with some of the heartbreak she'd already experienced, perhaps, I'm hoping, these years brought a degree of stability and happiness. Obviously, the records don't tell us a huge amount about what Nancy's everyday life was like during this period, but we do know one thing. She never forgot the Brontes, and they never completely forgot her either. And as the years passed, the children she'd helped care for became adults. Charlotte, Emily and Anne published novels. Branwell struggled with his health and his personal difficulties, and life carried them all in different directions. Yet Nancy remained connected to the family that she'd once lived alongside. Charlotte and Emily are said to have visited her in Bradford, and Nancy kept letters and mementos connected with the family. And when the news reached her of the deaths that gradually swept through Haworth, she must have felt those losses really deeply. Because after all, these weren't simply famous names to Nancy, they were people that she'd known since childhood, in some cases even birth. People that she'd fed, cared for and watched grow up. Branwell died in 1848, Emily followed the same year, Anne died in 1849 and obviously Charlotte in 1855. And one by one the children Nancy had once looked after were gone. I mean, it's rather sobering when you think about it, isn't it? I mean, the young servant girl who'd arrived in Thornton in 1816 would gradually outlive every one of the Brontë children. But her connection with the family wasn't over just yet, because in the years that followed, Nancy would become one of the most important witnesses to what life in the Brontë household had really been like. And she wasn't afraid to speak up when she thought people had got the story completely wrong. By the 1850s, the Brontë story was already becoming the stuff of legends. Charlotte's novels had made her famous, and after her death in 1855, there was this huge public interest in learning more about her and her family behind these famous books. That's when Elizabeth Gaskell entered the picture. Patrick Brontë gave her permission to write a biography of Charlotte, and in 1857 she published the famous book, The Life of Charlotte Brontë. Now, it's an important book and one that has shaped how generations of readers have viewed the Brontes. But, like many Victorian biographers, it wasn't based solely on official records and documents. Mrs. Gaskell also relied on memories, conversations and stories told by people who claimed to have known the family. One of these people was a lady called Martha Wright, a former nursemaid at Haworth, who had left the household under somewhat of a cloud. Exactly what happened isn't entirely clear, but Nancy and Sarah later claimed that Martha had been dismissed by Patrick Brontë for reasons he considered sufficient. I mean, that's a real Patrick thing. Whatever the truth, some of the stories that found their way into Mrs. Gaskell's book painted Patrick as eccentric and sometimes rather alarming figure. There were tales of him sawing the leg off chairs, burning rugs, destroying his children's colourful boots because they were too fashionable, even firing pistols wildly from the back door when he lost his temper. I mean, they're dramatic stories and I'm sure they helped sell the book, but these were the sort of stories that would stick in people's mind. The problem was that Nancy didn't believe they were true, and Nancy was in a very good position to know. I mean, she'd lived there for 8 years. She'd worked in the kitchen, she'd looked after the children, she spent years observing daily life in the parsonage. When people began repeating these stories, Nancy spoke up. She insisted that Patrick had never behaved in the way that accounts had suggested. One example involved the claim that Patrick refused to let the children eat meat. Nancy flatly rejected this and pointed out that the children had eaten meat every day of their lives. Another story claimed that Patrick burnt his children's boots because they were too colourful. And again, Nancy said this simply wasn't true. She even explained the pistol story. Patrick did own pistols, but according to Nancy, he carried them during journeys across lonely stretches of moorland and at times of unrest. Before entering the house, he would fire the loaded pistol simply to make them safe. It's not as dramatic as a man storming around the parsonage in a rage, really, is it? And one story Nancy did partly confirm involves a dress belonging to his wife Maria Brontë. According to Nancy, Patrick had jokingly teased his wife about the enormous sleeves on a fashionable new dress. Later, he cut the sleeves off. Not exactly ideal husband behaviour, but Nancy was clear that the story didn't end there. Patrick then went to Keighley and bought Maria a new silk dress to replace it. And what strikes me about all this is that Nancy didn't claim Patrick was perfect. She wasn't trying to turn him into a saint. She simply wanted people to know the man she'd actually known. And in fact, many years later, Nancy described Patrick as a kinder man than Mr. Brontë never drew breath. I mean, that's quite a statement from someone who'd worked for him and lived alongside him and remained in touch with him for decades afterwards. And Patrick appreciated her loyalty. In 1857, he even wrote a letter defending both Nancy and Sarah after claims were made that they had been wasteful servants. I mean, Nancy treasured that letter and kept it framed on her wall for the rest of her life. More than 30 years after leaving Haworth, she was still defending the family, and in return, Patrick was still defending her. I mean, that says a great deal about the relationship that they'd built over the years. But as Nancy grew older, life was becoming increasingly difficult, and the final chapter of the story was approaching. By the early 1880s, Nancy was in her late 70s. Her second husband, John Malone, died in 1881 after nearly 37 years of marriage. Once again, Nancy found herself alone, and once again, money became a problem. I mean, it's one of those uncomfortable reminders that growing old in Victorian Britain could be a frightening prospect, especially if you didn't have savings or a pension or a family able to support you. In 1884, at around 81 years old, Nancy entered the Bradford Workhouse. When people hear the word workhouse, they often picture something straight out of a Dickens novel. And in many cases, that image isn't far from the truth. Workhouses existed as part of the poor law system and were intended to provide shelter for those who could no longer support themselves. Conditions, they varied from place to place, but they were never somewhere where people hoped or wanted to end up. There's a certain sadness in knowing that a woman who'd spent years helping to raise the Brontë children eventually found herself there. But this is where Nancy's story takes a very unexpected turn. Because by this point, she wasn't entirely forgotten. Journalists have realised that living in the workhouse was a woman who had known the Brontë family intimately and who had outlived every one of the Brontë children. Reporters began visiting her and recording her memories. And thank goodness they did, because without those interviews we would know far less about Nancy than we do today. One reporter describes visiting her room and finding her surrounded by reminders of the past. She spoke warmly about the family that she'd known almost 70 years. Not as celebrities, not as names in books, but as people. The children that she'd looked after, the family that she'd worked for, the friends that she'd never forgotten. And what strikes me most is that there doesn't seem to be any bitterness in Nancy's memories. She wasn't looking back at life of hardship or complaining about it. Instead, she seemed genuinely happy to talk about the people that she'd known. She remembered Charlotte's kindness. She remembered Anne's gentle nature. She remembered Emily's fiery personality, and she still defended Branwell, saying he'd often been judged more harshly than he deserved. One reporter wrote that Nancy never tired of talking about the Brontes, and I think that's really lovely, because by this point almost everyone else connected to those early years at Thornton and Haworth had gone. Yet Nancy was still carrying those memories, still telling those stories, still making people remember the family that she'd once known. She also still had a number of Brontë keepsake. She had a travelling bag that Branwell had given her, Patrick's sovereign scales. She had letters and photographs and little reminders of a chapter of her life that never really left her. And while some of those items eventually found their way into collections, others seem to have disappeared altogether. To this day, nobody knows exactly what became of everything that Nancy owned. In particular, there are references to a photograph of Charlotte Brontë that may have been different from images that most of us have obviously seen today. Where is it? Whether it still exists somewhere hidden away in a drawer or a family collection, nobody seems to know. It's one of those little mysteries that still lingers around Nancy's story. But sadly, Nancy's own story was nearly at an end. Nancy Malone, better known to us obviously as Nancy Garrs, died on the 27th of March 1886, and she was 82 years old. Her obituary noted that admirers of the Brontes had continued to visit her in the workhouse and that she'd received offers of help and accommodation outside its walls. Yet, she had chosen to remain where she was. Even in her final years, people still sought her out because she represented something unique. She wasn't a biographer, she wasn't an historian, she wasn't a famous writer. She was simply someone who had known the Brontes when they were children. Someone who had been there. One detail I found particularly sad is that Nancy reportedly wished not to be buried in a pauper's grave. When she died, there were attempts to raise money for her burial. The story had even reached newspapers far beyond Yorkshire. But although she was buried in her sister Mary's family plot at Undercliff Cemetery, no headstone was ever erected. And as the years passed, the exact location became increasingly forgotten. The grass grew over, the weeds grew up, and the cemetery obviously changed. And people who remembered Nancy had died. And eventually there was nothing to tell visitors that she was there at all. I mean, which is extraordinary when you think about it. For many people, Nancy was that last living link to the childhood of the Brontë family, yet her own resting place gradually disappeared from view. Thankfully, that's not where the story ends. In recent years, volunteers researching the history of Undercliff Cemetery discovered where Nancy had been buried. The grave was finally identified, research was carried out, and support began to grow for a permanent memorial. Donations came from descendants of the Garrs family, as well as obviously people who simply felt that Nancy deserved to be remembered. And on the 27th of June 2022, more than 136 years after her death, a headstone was finally unveiled. And that's why I wanted to go there. Not because Nancy was famous, not because she wrote a great novel, not because she changed the course of literary history, but because ordinary people matter too. When we tell the story of the Brontes, we naturally focus on Charlotte and Emily, Anne and obviously Branwell. But families don't exist in isolation. There are always people in the background, people who are doing the caring for the children, the support in the household, they're sharing the difficult times, and they become woven into everyday life. Nancy was one of those people, and for 8 years she helped care for the Bronte children through some of the most important years of their lives. She remained loyal to them long after she'd left Haworth. She defended them when she felt they'd been treated unfairly. And she spent the rest of her life talking warmly about the family that she'd known. To me, that makes Nancy's story worth telling, not because she was connected to the famous family, but because she was Nancy. And perhaps that's exactly why she deserves to be remembered. Right, trusty carrier bag, earn your keep. Famous carrier bag. It's been everywhere. It's a decent size. It's quite good at keeping out the damp. And oh no, I've just ripped my dress. Look, I was over enthusiastic with my carrier bag and I've ripped my dress. Oh my goodness, but as a sewer I should be able to mend that, but still. I love this dress. Problem is, it's such a hot day. You couldn't sit out in the sun for long because it would just, you'd slowly fry, be all crispy. So I'm coming into the very old bit of the graveyard, which I'll show you. I'll take you round and show you. But for now, let's see if we can find some shade. Whew. There's got to be somewhere we can go. Some of these though, I mean, they must have taken so long to make and they must have been so expensive. I mean, I know it was a way of showing off your wealth, wasn't it? You know, look at me, I own so much that I can afford to have a mini cathedral built almost in the cemetery, and I want my tower to be bigger than my neighbours, and I want my letters to be gold, and I want pots, and I want people, and I want pointy bits. But there seems to be, on this side, seems to be a lot of pots with like cloths draped over them. Obviously it was a thing. It was the fashion. Yes, I want a big pot on mine. Yes, and I want a pointy stick on mine. Yes, I want big letters. I want tiny letters so everyone can have to come up close and have a look at me. Oh, gosh, it's really, really hot. Grubby was an understatement. I think that was someone's brakes on their bike going down. There's a slight hill behind our house and the bike riders love it because it's, you know, a bit of a challenge because there's a big corner. And yeah, the thing is they go down and they don't realise that they're shouting at each other. They think they're just having a conversation, but when you go past you hear them going, turn right, turn right. In 1838, Nancy's life changed. I had a bucket outside drying from what I used yesterday, and the wind has just blown it across the patio. Try that again. I mean, it's difficult to imagine just how... Let's see, shall we? Should we see if we can take you somewhere a bit better? Look at that beautiful sun. I'm going to squint though. Maybe we will. We'll do that bit in a bit. Okay, put it this way. I'll do it here. And then I'll do it again down there in a bit. Okay, don't let me forget. Can't believe I'm having a conversation with my camera as if it's a human. Before I go, I would love to hear your thoughts. So I've got my 3 famous questions for you. So number 1, have you heard of Nancy Garrs before watching this video? Number 2, what part of the story surprised you the most? And number 3, do you think people like Nancy deserve a bigger place in Bronte history? Let me know your answers and your thoughts in the comments below. So thank you so much for watching. If you like this video, please do that whole likey, subscribey, hypey thingy, because it really does help me out and it lets YouTube know that we want to watch more Brontë content. Have a great weekend, take care of yourselves, keep cool, and I will see you all the Friday after next for more Brontë adventures. See you then. Bye.